The morning Mabel left, she did not weep. That was the part that haunted Adrian long after the cold had settled into the stone walls of Vordenhall Castle. Not the silence she left behind. Not the untouched goblet of spiced wine still sitting on her side of the table. Not even the gray woolen cloak missing from its iron hook by the chamber door. What haunted him was the absence of tears. He had braced for crying. He had prepared arguments against sobbing, against pleading, against the soft, broken voice she sometimes used when she thought no one could hear her through the thick oak panels of the corridor. Instead, she had looked at him with those pale blue eyes, still and clear as a frozen lake in the heart of winter, and said nothing at all. She simply walked away. 6 months earlier, Mabel had arrived at Vordenhall as the newly declared mate of King Adrian Voss, Alpha King of the Northern Realm. She had come from the village of Ashven, a small settlement pressed against the edge of the Greywood Forest, where the pines grew so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground before noon. She was an Omega, born into a family of Omegas, marked by the soft gold of her bond scent, the kind that made Alphas pause in crowded halls without knowing why. Her hair was the color of winter wheat, worn in a long braid that fell over one shoulder. Her face was rosy from years of cold wind and outdoor work, her hands calloused from the healer's workroom where she had apprenticed since her 15th year. She had not sought the king. The king's wolf had found her during a border patrol through Ashven, drawn through the tree line by something his beta couldn't explain, and his gamma called a curse. Adrian himself had said nothing about it for 3 days. 3 days of campfires and leather armor and frozen ground. Before he rode back into Ashven at dawn, and stood before the door of the healer's cottage like a man who had lost an argument with himself, Mabel remembered opening that door and finding him there. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark braided hair scattered with snowflakes, his ice-blue eyes carrying the particular expression of a man who was deeply unused to uncertainty. A scar ran along his jaw, thin and silver, and he wore the black leather vest and crossed chest straps of the king's personal guard, though the iron crown at his belt told a different story. She had offered him a cup of pine needle broth. He had accepted it with both hands, as if it were more valuable than any treasure in his vaults. That was how it began. The first months inside Vordenhall had not been easy for her. The castle rose from the northern cliffs like a declaration, all dark stone and iron torches and wolf-carved parapets, and its inhabitants were not gentle with newcomers, least of all with an Omega from a forest village who wore plain linen dresses and still smelled faintly of dried lavender and healing herbs. Lady Seren was the first to make her displeasure known. Seren was beta-born, the daughter of a lord from the eastern reaches, and she had occupied a particular space in the castle's social order long before Mabel arrived, close to the king's council table, close to his ear, and, if the whispers that traveled through the servants' corridor were to be believed, once close to far more than that. She was tall, dark-haired, sharp-jawed, and wore her gowns in deep crimson, as if she had decided long ago that the color suited her, and the rest of the world could adjust accordingly. When Mabel was formally presented in the great hall, Seren had looked at her the way a hawk looks at something small, moving through tall grass, patient, precise, entirely without mercy. "The Omega healer," she had said, her voice warm with a poisonous kind of pleasantry. "How unexpected of you, my king." Adrian had said nothing. That, Mabel would later understand, was itself a kind of answer. Commander Bren, the king's gamma and most trusted battlefield officer, had been the only one to meet Mabel's eyes that first evening without calculation behind his own. He was a broad man, scarred across the knuckles from 30 years of service, with close-cropped gray hair and the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many campaigns staring into wind-driven snow. He had simply nodded at her across the great hall and returned to his ale, which she found, in the strange arithmetic of first impressions, deeply reassuring. She had not yet understood that Bren's quiet acceptance meant something in Vordenhall, that his nod, seen by at least 4 members of the king's inner circle, was a signal others would remember. What she also had not yet understood was that Seren had never truly left. Not in the way that mattered. The betrayal did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like dawn, slowly, and then all at once. It was a servant girl, Petra, who found Mabel in the east corridor on a gray Tuesday morning, her face pale beneath her freckles, her voice barely above a breath. She pressed a folded piece of parchment into Mabel's hands, and then walked very quickly in the opposite direction without being asked to. Mabel stood alone in the corridor. The stone floor was cold through her thin boots. A torch flickered in the iron sconce above her head, throwing unsteady orange light across the parchment. She read it once. Then she read it again. The words didn't change. She had known, in the abstract way one knows about winter before it arrives, that Seren and Adrian shared a history older than she was part of. She had told herself it did not matter, that history was not the same as the present, that the bond between a mated pair was a living thing, that she had seen something real in his eyes when he looked at her, something that could not be manufactured. What the parchment described was not history. It described last night. She did not go to him in anger. She did not go to him at all, not immediately. She went instead to the healer's room in the lower castle, a stone chamber smelling of chamomile and wood smoke and old iron. And she sat on the low wooden stool beside the herb-drying rack for a very long time, her hands in her lap, her braid coming loose at the end, one pale strand falling across her cheek. A gray cat that belonged to no one in particular came and sat at her feet. She listened to the sounds of the castle going about its morning, the clang of the smith's hammer from the yard, the distant bark of a training command from the outer barracks, the creak of the supply wagons making their way through the north gate, all of it ordinary, all of it entirely unaware that something had just broken. When she finally rose, she straightened her dress, retied her braid, and walked with measured steps to the chamber she shared with the king. He was there, standing at the narrow window with a goblet in his hand, looking out over the snow-dusted courtyard. He turned when he heard her, and something in his expression shifted. A shadow of something she could not name, but which she would later identify as guilt, wearing the mask of composure. She set the parchment on the table between them. He looked at it. He did not deny it. That silence was its own kind of confirmation, heavy and absolute as iron. Mabel held his gaze for a long moment. Her pale blue eyes were clear. Her hands were still. She reached up, unpinned the small copper brooch that held her gray cloak at the collar, the one he had given her on the morning of their bonding ceremony, cast in the shape of a running wolf, and set it beside the parchment. Then she turned and walked out of Vordenhall Castle. She did not weep, and she did not look back. No one stopped her at the gate. The two guards on duty exchanged a glance but said nothing. She was the queen, and queens were not questioned about their morning walks, even when those walks carried a small leather satchel, and the particular stillness of someone who has already decided everything that needed deciding. The Greywood received her like an old friend. The pines closed around her, and the smell of frozen earth and cold resin settled over her shoulders like a different kind of cloak, one that asked nothing and offered everything. She walked north. Behind her, in the great hall of Vordenhall Castle, a copper wolf brooch sat on a table beside an unread parchment, and the king who had let the wrong person close stood at a narrow window watching snow fall on a courtyard that felt, for the first time in 6 months, entirely empty. The Greywood did not forgive weakness. That was the first lesson it taught, and it taught it without mercy. Mabel learned it in the opening hours of that first night, when the temperature dropped so sharply that her breath came out in thick clouds, and the thin linen of her dress offered nothing against the cold that pressed in from every direction like a living thing. She had her satchel. Inside it, a small knife, a length of cord, a pouch of dried herbs, a flint and iron striker, and a folded wool blanket she had grabbed from the healer's room without entirely planning to. Not much. Enough, perhaps, if she was careful. She was always careful. She built her first fire in the hollow of a fallen pine, using dead bark and the small dry branches that collected in the sheltered spaces between roots. Her fingers were numb by the time the spark caught, and she pressed her palms toward the flame with something that felt almost like gratitude. The orange light spread up the inner curve of the fallen trunk, casting warm shadows across the frost-stiffened moss. And for a few minutes, she simply breathed. Then she took stock of where she was, what she had, and what she intended to do. The answer to that last question was the hardest one. She had left. That part was clear, and she did not regret it. Could not regret it, even as the cold worked its way into her bones, and the darkness of the grey wood stretched in every direction without comfort. What was less clear was what came next. She had no clan. Her parents had passed when she was 19, within a season of each other, the way bonded pairs sometimes did when the thread between them was strong enough. She had no siblings. The healers of Ashvin were kind people, but going back there felt like walking backward into a life that no longer fit the shape she had become. So she walked north. She found the Lycan settlement on the third day, more by the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat than by any intention of her own. She had been following a frozen stream through a narrow valley when the wind shifted, carrying with it the warm, unmistakable scent of a cooking fire. And beneath it, something older and wilder. The layered, complex scent of Lycan wolves, different from the pack-born alphas of the southern kingdoms, in the way a deep forest is different from a managed woodland. Rawer, more ancient. She stopped at the edge of the tree line and considered her options for a moment. Then her stomach made the decision for her, and she stepped into the clearing. The settlement was not large, perhaps 40 souls in total, living in long timber halls with turf roofs and carved wooden doorposts. The kind of construction that looked rough from a distance and revealed itself to be precise and purposeful up close. Smoke curled from the roof vents. Children ran between the buildings, then stopped to stare at her with enormous eyes. A woman carrying a bundle of firewood paused and looked her over with calm, unhurried assessment. "Omega," the woman said. Not an accusation, not a welcome. Simply an identification. "Yes," Mabel said. "From the south?" "From the Greywood. 3 days walking." The woman shifted the bundle of wood in her arms and tilted her head. "Alone?" "Yes." A long pause. The cold settled between them. Then the woman said, "Come inside. You'll eat before we ask you anything else." That was how Mabel met Runa. Runa was the elder of the Lycan settlement, not in years alone, though she was at least 60. Her silver hair cropped short, and her face deeply lined by weather and time. She held authority the way old trees hold their ground, without effort, without announcement, simply by being exactly what she was and refusing to be anything less. She had wolf-gray eyes and wore a heavy mantle of dark fur over a linen tunic, and she listened to Mabel's story, the shortened, essential version of it, without interrupting once. When Mabel finished, Runa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know how to heal." "I was apprenticed for 6 years. Bone setting, fever management, poison remedies. All of those." Runa looked at her for a long moment, measuring something invisible. "We have need of a healer. Our last one was lost to the winter fever 2 months ago. I'll offer you shelter and place at the table in exchange for your skills. No obligation beyond that. If you wish to leave in the spring, you leave." Mabel looked around the low-ceilinged hall. The fire was warm. The smell of pine resin and venison broth rose from the iron pot hanging above the flames. At the far end of the hall, an old man was telling a story to 3 children who sat cross-legged on the earthen floor, their faces turned up to him with complete attention. "I'll stay," Mabel said. The months that followed were not easy, but they were honest, and Mabel found that honesty suited her in ways that the gilded corridors of Vordenhall never quite had. She worked hard from dawn to dusk, tending wounds, brewing medicines, learning the Lycan remedies that differed from southern pack practices in ways that fascinated her. She learned that Lycan wolves healed differently, that certain herbs that worked on pack-born wolves could harm a Lycan constitution, that the bond between a Lycan and their wolf was more unified, less divided. They did not shift into 2 distinct states so much as they existed always somewhere between. She also learned gradually that she was not merely surviving. She was changing. It began with small things. Her senses sharpened in ways she couldn't entirely explain. She began to smell the difference between a coming snowstorm and a cold night, to hear a footstep outside the hall a full minute before it reached the door. Runa noticed and said nothing for several weeks. Then one morning she set a cup of dark liquid on the table in front of Mabel and sat down across from her. "Drink that," she said. "And then I'll tell you something about yourself that I think you may not yet know." The liquid tasted of pine bark and something deeper, metallic, warm, faintly electric against the tongue. "Your mother," Runa said. "Was she fully Omega?" Mabel set the cup down. "She was. My father, too." "And her mother?" A longer pause. "I don't know. She died before I was born. My mother never spoke of her." Runa folded her hands on the table. "What I am going to tell you will sound impossible. But you have been here 4 months, and in 4 months I have watched you heal faster than any Omega born. Sense what no Omega should sense, and carry a stillness under pressure that belongs to something older than pack hierarchy." She paused. "There is lichen blood in your line, child. Old blood, perhaps diluted by generations. But old blood does not disappear. It sleeps. And sometimes when a person is pushed far enough to the edge of themselves, it wakes." Mabel sat very still. "The cold that should have killed you in the Greywood," Runa continued quietly. "The 3 days alone that you survived when a southern Omega would have turned back on the first night. The healing speed you thought was simply your constitution." She held Mabel's gaze. "These are not coincidences." Outside, snow had begun to fall again, drifting past the small oiled cloth window in soft, unhurried curtains. Mabel looked at her hands on the table, the calloused palms, the healer's fingers. She thought of her mother's mother, the woman no one spoke of, the woman whose name her mother had said only once, quietly, on a night of high fever, in a language Mabel didn't recognize. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means," Runa said, "that we have work to do." The training was not what she expected. She had imagined, if she had imagined anything, something physical, something to do with shifting and strength and combat. What Runa gave her instead was far more demanding than that. It was the work of learning to listen to her own wolf, not the muted secondary presence of an Omega wolf, but something that had been buried beneath generations of diluted blood and social hierarchy, something that had been quietly suffocating under the weight of a castle and a bonding and a betrayal. It surfaced in pieces, first as heat in her sternum during moments of emotional intensity, then as something close to a second voice, not words exactly, but a knowing, a directional certainty. Then in the middle of a snowstorm on a night in deep winter, when she was alone in the forest checking traps, and a pack of rogue wolves appeared at the tree line with hunger in their eyes, it surfaced entirely. She remembered very little of what happened next. She remembered standing her ground when instinct said run. She remembered the heat spreading from her chest to her hands, to the ground beneath her feet, and the way the rogue wolves stopped, and then backed away, one by one, into the darkness of the trees. When she returned to the settlement, Runa was waiting outside in the snow, as if she had known. "Well," the elder said simply. Mabel looked at her own hands. They had stopped shaking. "Well," she agreed. By the time spring arrived, and then passed, and the second summer settled golden over the northern valleys, no one in the settlement called her the Omega Healer anymore. They called her what she had become. And word, in the way that word always does when it carries enough weight, began to travel south. The rumor reached Vordenhall on a merchant's tongue. It arrived buried inside a longer story about northern trade routes and the price of salted venison, delivered to the castle's head steward by a fur trader who had spent the winter months moving between the lichen settlements above the Greywood's northern border. The steward, a meticulous man named Aldrich, who had served the castle for 20 years and prided himself on knowing which information mattered and which did not, listened to the merchant's account with his usual expression of contained patience. Then, one detail made him set down his quill. He went directly to Commander Bren. Bren listened without expression, which was his way of listening to everything. When Aldrich finished, the commander asked 2 questions, precise, practical questions about direction and timeline, and then dismissed the steward with a nod that carried the full weight of "I will handle this, and you will not speak of it further." A nod that Aldrich, after 2 decades of service, understood perfectly. Bren sat alone in his quarters for a long time after that, his scarred hands flat on the oak table, the single candle on the table burning down by a third, before he moved again. Then he went to find the king. Adrian had not been the same since Mabel left. This was not a thing spoken aloud in Vordenhall. The castle had learned quickly that certain observations were safest kept behind sealed lips. But it was a thing known, the way weather is known before it arrives, felt in the air and the stone and the particular quality of silence that settled over a place when the person holding it together walks out the gate. He had sent search parties in the first week. 3 of them, each one returning with nothing. No trail, no scent trace past the edge of the Greywood, no word from any settlement within 2 days' ride. The Greywood, apparently, had absorbed her the way it absorbed everything, completely, and without apology. After the 3rd search party came back empty-handed, he had stood in the Great Hall for a long moment without speaking, and then he had walked to his war room and closed the door, and when it opened again he was, outwardly, the king again. Outwardly. Bren had known Adrian since the man was 17 years old, and too proud and too angry, and too certain of himself in the precise combination that made young Alpha Kings both formidable and catastrophic. He had watched him grow into something steadier, something that earned the loyalty it commanded rather than simply demanding it. And he had watched, with the quiet concern of a man who loved the king the way old soldiers love the commanders they've bled beside, the way Adrian's eyes went to the east corridor every time he entered the Great Hall, the corridor that led to the healer's room, the corridor he no longer walked. Seren, for her part, had moved through the aftermath with the composed precision of someone who had planned for this outcome and found the result satisfying. She had not declared herself openly, was not foolish enough for that, but she had positioned herself back into the king's daily orbit with the practiced ease of long familiarity, appearing at council meetings, at the evening meal, at the quiet moments in the library, when Adrian stood at the shelves and stared at the spines of books without reading them. Bren watched this with the patience of a man who understood that some battles were not won by force. He knocked on the war room door that night and waited. Enter. Adrian was at the long table, bent over a map of the Northern Territories, a half-empty goblet of dark wine at his elbow. He looked up when Bren came in, and something in his expression shifted. A fractional opening, the kind that only happened when the person entering was one of the very few he allowed past the wall. "You have something," Adrian said, not a question. Bren closed the door behind him. A merchant came through from the northern settlements above the Greywood. He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man placing his feet on uncertain ground. "There are accounts of a woman in the Lycan territories, a healer, blonde, arrived alone in the deep winter, 6 months past." The room was very quiet. Adrian set down the iron compass he'd been holding. "Go on." "The accounts don't stop at healer." Bren met the king's eyes steadily. "They say she's been training with Runa of the Northern Lycans, that something in her bloodline was dormant and has emerged, that in the Lycan settlements above the Coldwater Valley, they have been calling her—" He stopped, took a breath. "They have been calling her the Lycan Queen." The candle on the table flickered in a draft from under the door. Adrian said nothing. His jaw was set, the scar along it catching the candlelight. His ice-blue eyes were unreadable in the way they became unreadable when something had struck deep enough that no surface expression could contain it. "Is it her?" he asked finally, quietly. "The description fits. Blonde braid, healer's hands, pale blue eyes." Bren paused. Arrived alone, in winter, with a small satchel. Another long silence. Then Adrian reached for the goblet, changed his mind, and pushed it away. He stood and walked to the narrow window, his back to the room, his braided hair dark against the pale stone wall. Outside, the courtyard was lit by torchlight and moonlight in equal measure, the cobblestones frost-bright. "She is alive," he said. The words came out low, like something that had been held under pressure for a long time. "It appears so, my king." He was quiet again. Then, "How long?" "The merchant said the accounts go back several months. She has been there through the winter and the spring. And this—" He stopped. Started again. "Lycan Queen. What does that mean, Bren? In real terms, not in rumor terms." Bren moved to stand beside him at the window. He chose honesty over comfort, as he always had. "In real terms, it means that whatever she is now, she is not what she was when she left this castle. And it means that the northern Lycan clans, who have been independent of every southern kingdom for 4 generations, are apparently willing to follow her." He paused. "That is not a small thing." "No," Adrian said. "It is not." Below in the courtyard, a guard changed at the gate, the familiar exchange of words and footsteps carrying clearly in the cold air. Ordinary, unchanging. The castle continuing its life, indifferent to the thing that had just shifted inside this room. "I made a mistake," Adrian said. The words were flat, stripped of ceremony, carrying in their very plainness the weight of how much it cost him to say them. Bren said nothing. It was not the kind of statement that needed a response. It needed to exist, to be spoken into the air of an empty room, to be real rather than thought. "She walked out of this gate because I—" He stopped again. His hands, gripped behind his back, tightened briefly. "Because I was a fool who confused familiarity with loyalty and called it nothing when it was everything." Still, Bren said nothing. "And now she is something entirely different." Adrian continued quietly. "In a territory I have no claim over, followed by clans that owe me nothing. And the last time she looked at me, she left a copper brooch on a table and didn't say a single word." He turned from the window. His face was controlled, but his eyes were not. "And I cannot decide if the silence was mercy or verdict." Bren considered this for a moment. Then he said, in the direct way that had always been his particular gift, "My king, does it matter which it was? The question worth asking is what you intend to do about it." Adrian looked at him for a long moment. "What I intend," he said slowly, "is to find out if a man who let something irreplaceable walk away is capable of earning it back." He reached for the map on the table and turned it so the northern territories faced up. "And I intend to ride north." "Alone?" Bren asked, his tone perfectly neutral in the way that communicated deep skepticism without technically expressing it. "With a small company." Quietly. He traced the northern route with one finger. "I will not arrive as the Alpha King commanding an audience. I will not send word ahead. I will not arrive with banners." His finger stopped on the territory above the Coldwater Valley. "I will arrive as what I am, which is a man who owes an apology to someone who deserves far better than what I gave her." Bren nodded once. Then, "And Lady Seren?" The question landed in the room with careful precision. Adrian looked up from the map. Something in his expression had clarified, hardened into a certainty that had not been there 6 months ago. Perhaps had never been there in quite this form. "Seren will be addressed before I leave," he said, formally, finally, and completely. He held Bren's gaze. "I should have done it long ago. I should have done it before Mabel ever set foot in this castle. The fact that I did not is the root of everything that followed, and I will not leave this place without closing it." Bren let out a slow breath. "I'll prepare a quiet company. 6 riders. We can leave at dawn the day after tomorrow." "Good." Bren moved toward the door. Then he stopped, his hand on the iron latch, and looked back. He was not a man who said sentimental things. The sentiment was always there. somewhere underneath the practical exterior. But he kept it contained as a matter of principle. What he said instead was, "For what it is worth, she was the right one. Whatever she is now, wherever she is, she was always the right one." Adrian looked at the map for a moment. "I know," he said quietly. "I knew it the first morning I stood at a healer's door in the snow, and she handed me a cup of pine broth without flinching." He picked up the copper wolf brooch from the corner of the map table, where it had sat for 6 months, and closed his fist around it. "I should have known it better," he said, "and I didn't. And now I have to go find out if knowing it better, finally, is enough." The Coldwater Valley earned its name honestly. The river that cut through its center ran fast and shallow over pale gray stones, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above, and even in the height of summer it carried a cold that made the bones of anyone who crossed it ache for an hour after. Adrian felt it through his boots as his horse picked its way across the ford, the water rushing white around the animal's legs, the spray cold against his hands where he held the reins. Behind him, 5 riders followed in silence. Bren was directly at his back, as he had been for 20 years. The others were men Adrian trusted without reservation, not because they were the strongest fighters in his guard, but because they were the ones least likely to let pride override judgment in a situation that called for neither banners nor drawn swords. They had ridden for 4 days through the upper Greywood and beyond, sleeping in the open on furs spread over frozen ground, eating trail provisions and the occasional catch from Bren's snares. Adrian had not allowed himself to think too far ahead, had kept his mind on the immediate, the next landmark, the next campfire, the next gray dawn. Thinking too far ahead meant thinking about what he would say when he arrived, and he had not yet found words that felt adequate. Everything he composed in his head sounded either too formal or too desperate, and the truth was probably somewhere between the two, in the uncomfortable territory where pride went to be dismantled. The valley opened before them as they crested the last ridge, spreading wide and quiet under a pale summer sky. He could see the settlement from the ridge, the long timber halls, the smoke rising from the roof vents, the figures moving between the buildings in the unhurried way of people who belonged completely to the place they occupied. He could also see, at a distance that was still too great for features to be certain, a figure standing at the edge of the settlement's outer fence. Still, watching them come. Something in his chest tightened. They had been seen long before they arrived. That was evident from the quiet, organized way the settlement had arranged itself by the time Adrian and his company rode through the outer gate. Not with weapons drawn, but with the particular stillness of people who were entirely prepared for whatever came next, and were not afraid of it. Men and women stood in loose groupings near the hall doors, watching. A few of the older children had climbed onto the fence rails for a better view. 2 lichen warriors, large, unhurried, wearing the layered leather and fur of the northern style, stood on either side of the gate as Adrian passed through. They did not bow. He had not expected them to, and he did not require it. That was not why he had come. An elder woman stood at the center of the open yard, silver-haired, gray-eyed, wearing a heavy fur mantle with the ease of someone who had worn it for decades. She looked at Adrian with the calm, assessing gaze of a person who had long since stopped being impressed by power and had replaced that impression with something sharper, discernment. "Alpha King," she said. Her voice was steady and unhurried. "You have come a long way." Adrian dismounted and handed his reins to Bren without looking away from her. "Elder Runa," he said. He had learned her name from the merchant's account, and the respect in his voice was genuine. She radiated the kind of authority that did not depend on titles and could not be faked. I am grateful for the passage through your territory. Grateful enough to come with only 6 riders and no banners," Runa observed. The faintest note of approval colored her voice, so faint it might have been imagined. "I did not come to assert anything," he said. "I came to speak with someone, if she is willing." A pause. Around the yard, the settlement waited. "That," Runa said, will depend entirely on her. She stepped aside, and Mabel walked out of the hall. Adrian had prepared himself, or believed he had, for the change in her. The merchant's accounts had been clear enough, and 6 months was long enough for a person to become someone different when the circumstances demanded it. He had told himself he was ready. He was not ready. She wore a deep charcoal tunic over linen, with leather bracers on both forearms and a short knife at her belt, practical, unadorned, entirely at ease on a woman who had once worn healers' aprons and plain linen dresses. Her blonde hair was still in its characteristic braid, but it was thicker now, wound through with a thin cord of dark leather, and she wore it forward over one shoulder with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had stopped thinking about how they looked and started thinking about how they moved. Her face was browned by months of outdoor life, the rosiness of it replaced by something steadier, weathered and certain. But it was her eyes that stopped him. The pale blue was the same. That had not changed. But the clarity in them, the particular quality of stillness, was different now. Before, it had been the stillness of someone who was carefully holding themselves together. Now it was something else entirely. It was the stillness of someone who had nothing left to hold together, because they had built themselves back from the ground up, and what they had built was solid. She looked at him across the yard with those eyes, and she did not move toward him, and she did not step away. She simply waited. He crossed the yard. He was aware of every eye in the settlement on him, aware of Bren standing absolutely motionless at the gate, aware of Runa watching from the side with the calm attention of someone observing a thing they have long been anticipating. He was aware of all of it, and he set it aside, because none of it was the point. He stopped 3 paces from her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to give her every choice. "Mabel," he said. "Adrian," she said. Her voice was the same, low, clear, unhurried. A healer's voice, accustomed to rooms where panic was already present and did not need to be added to. He held her gaze. He had thought about this moment for 4 days on the road, and for 6 months before that. And now that it was here, all of the composed speeches dissolved, and what remained was simply the truth, unadorned. "I came to say that what I did was wrong," he said. "Not wrong in the way that inconvenient things are called wrong. Wrong in the fundamental sense, a betrayal of something real, something that deserved better than it received from me." He paused. "I came to say that I am sorry, that the word is not enough, and I know it is not enough, and I am not here with the expectation that sorry resolves anything." He reached into the pouch at his belt and withdrew the copper wolf brooch, the one she had left on the table, the one he had carried for 6 months, the metal worn smooth on one side from the number of times he had held it. He held it out on his open palm. "I came to give this back, not as a demand, not as a claim, just because it was yours, and it belonged with you, not sitting on a table in a room you walked out of." She looked at the brooch on his palm. The small copper wolf, cast mid-stride, its lines worn softer now from months of handling. She did not take it immediately. "Why did you let her back in?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, without accusation, genuinely asking. He had known the question would come. He had not been able to answer it satisfactorily in his own head, which was, he had come to understand, precisely the problem. "Because I confused history with safety," he said slowly. "Because Seren was familiar, and familiar felt like solid ground when I was still learning how to trust something as real as what you and I had begun. That is not a justification. It is simply the truth of the failure." "And now?" She held his gaze steadily. "She is still at Vordenhall?" "She is not," he said. "She left the castle a month ago. I ended her position on the council formally, with witnesses, and with a complete accounting of what had occurred. She has returned to her father's estate in the eastern reaches." He paused. "That should have happened before you ever arrived. The fact that it did not is something I carry." Mabel looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the valley was quiet, the river's voice a constant low current beneath everything. You should know, she said finally, that I am not the same person who left. I can see that. I am not saying that as a warning, she clarified. I am saying it so that if you are looking for the woman who was grateful to be chosen and too uncertain to ask for what she deserved, that woman learned some things in the Greywood, and she is not coming back. The faintest edge entered her voice, not sharp but definite. What came back is something else. I know, he said. I am not here looking for who you were. I am here because of who you are. He held her gaze. And because I would rather spend whatever is left of my life earning back the trust of someone who deserves better than I gave her, than spend it in a castle that has felt empty since the morning she walked out the gate. The yard was completely silent. Runa, from the side, made no expression whatsoever, which somehow communicated profound satisfaction. Mabel looked at the brooch again. Then she reached out and took it from his palm, her fingers closing around the copper wolf with a steadiness that did not waver. She did not pin it. Not yet. She held it in her closed hand and looked at him with those clear, rebuilt eyes. You'll stay tonight, she said. Your riders can sleep in the outer hall. There is food. A pause. And tomorrow we will talk. Properly. All of it. It was not forgiveness. It was not a return. It was something more honest than either of those things. It was the opening of a door that had not been closed permanently after all, and the unspoken understanding that what lay beyond it would have to be walked through carefully, by both of them, with eyes open. Thank you, he said. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked back toward the hall, and she did not look back. But this time, he understood, the not looking back meant something entirely different than it had 6 months ago on the road from Vordenhall. This time it meant, follow, if you mean it. He did. What neither of them knew, in that quiet yard in the Coldwater Valley, was that 3 days south of them, on a road that moved through the eastern edge of the Greywood, a rider in dark colors was making his way north with a sealed letter and instructions from someone who had not accepted the closure of any door as permanent, and that the conversation Adrian and Mabel were about to have the next morning would be interrupted before it was finished. The morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of northern summer morning that apologized for nothing. Sharp air, long gold light, cutting low across the valley. The river catching the sun in fragments of white and silver. Adrian had slept in the outer hall on a rough cot beside his men, under a wool blanket that smelled of pine smoke and old leather, and he had slept better than he had in 6 months, which told him something about the particular quality of being in the right place even before the right place had fully accepted him. He was in the yard, helping one of the settlement's young men retention a fence post, when Bren appeared at his shoulder with the particular quality of stillness that meant something was wrong. Ryder came in through the south gate 20 minutes ago, Bren said quietly. Dark colors, no insignia. He's asking for the woman they call the Lycan Queen. Adrian set down the mallet in his hand. Where is he now? Runa has him in the small hall. She sent for you both. The rider was young, perhaps 22, with the lean, road-worn look of someone who had been moving fast and sleeping little. He sat on a bench in the small hall with a sealed letter in his hands, and the expression of a man who had been given a task and was not entirely comfortable with what that task had turned out to involve on closer inspection. When Adrian entered behind Mabel and Runa, the rider's eyes went first to Adrian, and then, with visible recalibration, to Mabel, and something in his posture shifted. A small, involuntary acknowledgement of what she was now that had nothing to do with title and everything to do with what radiated from her when she walked into a room. Who sent you? Mabel asked. She stood with her arms loose at her sides, her voice level. The rider glanced at Adrian again. Then he held out the letter. Mabel took it, broke the seal, and read it. Her face did not change expression. When she finished, she folded it once, precisely, and held it at her side. It is from Seren, she said. She looked at Adrian. She writes that she has information regarding my bloodline, that she has known for some time what I am, and that if I do not meet her at the border crossing at Fens Bridge within 3 days, she will take that information to the Eastern Lords and use it to challenge the legitimacy of any claim I hold in the Northern Territories. She paused. She calls it a negotiation. The room was very quiet. Adrian's jaw was set, the scar along it a thin white line in the morning light. "It is not a negotiation," he said flatly. "It is a threat." "Yes," Mabel agreed. Her voice was perfectly calm. "It is." Runa, standing at the side of the room, made a low sound that might have been contempt and might have been something colder. "She has been watching longer than you knew," the elder said. "People like that always have." She looked at Mabel. "The question is what you intend to do about it." Mabel looked at the folded letter in her hand for a moment. Then she looked up, and what was in her eyes was not fear and was not fury. It was the clear, considered steadiness of someone who had already lived through the worst thing that could happen to her and discovered she was still standing on the other side of it. "I intend to go to Fens Bridge," she said. Adrian opened his mouth. "Not to negotiate," Mabel said, before he could speak. "To end it." They rode south the following dawn. Mabel and Adrian, Bren and 2 of the settlement's Lycan warriors who volunteered without being asked, and Runa, who informed everyone that she was coming, and that anyone who suggested otherwise would find the suggestion returned to them without gentleness. The road through the lower Greywood took them 2 days at a steady pace. They rode mostly in silence, the kind of silence that exists between people who have too much to say any of it yet, who are holding the important conversation in reserve for a moment when the immediate danger has passed. But on the first evening, when the camp was made, and the fire was built, and the others had settled into their own quiet conversations, Mabel and Adrian sat on opposite sides of the fire and talked. Not about Seren, about everything else. About the morning he had stood at the healer's door in Ashfen with snow in his hair. About the first weeks in Vordenhall, when she had felt the weight of every stone in the walls pressing on her. About the things he had not said when he should have said them, and the space that silence had left for old habits to return. About the Greywood in the first hours, the cold, the fire she had built alone, the grey cat at her feet in the healer's room before she left. About Runa, and the cup of dark liquid, and the night the rogue wolves backed away from her at the tree line. He listened to all of it without interrupting. She watched his face across the fire, and saw the full weight of what he was hearing settle into him without flinching. That, she thought, was new. Or perhaps it had always been there, and she had not stayed long enough to see it reach the surface. "I was afraid of it," he said quietly, when she had finished. "What I felt when my wolf found you, it was..." He paused, choosing the word carefully. "It was not what I expected a bond to feel like. I expected something I could manage, something that fit inside the shape of the life I had already built." He met her eyes across the fire. "What I felt instead was something that required me to become a different kind of person than I had been. And I was not ready for that. So I reached for what was familiar instead of being worthy of what was real." The fire crackled between them. Above the trees, the stars were extraordinarily clear. "Are you ready now?" she asked, not cruelly, simply asking. "I do not know if ready is the right word," he said honestly. "I know that I have spent 6 months understanding what I lost, and I know that what I lost was not a queen or a bond or a political alliance." He held her gaze steadily. "It was you. Specifically. The woman who handed me pine broth at dawn without flinching. The woman who sat in the healer's room alone when everything fell apart and did not let anyone see her break." A pause. "I would like the chance to know who that woman has become, if she is willing." The fire settled, sending a small cascade of sparks upward into the dark. Mabel reached into the small pouch at her belt and drew out the copper wolf brooch, She had been carrying it for 2 days, not pinned, just held. She looked at it for a moment in the firelight. Then she pinned it at the collar of her tunic, precisely where it had always sat. She did not make a speech about it. She did not need to. The gesture was its own language, and he understood it. And she saw in his face that he did. "We deal with Seren first," she said. "Then we talk about the rest." "Agreed," he said. Fenn's Bridge was a narrow stone crossing over a fast tributary of the Coldwater River, at the edge of the territory where the Greywood's northern arm met the beginning of the eastern reaches. It was old, the stone worn smooth by centuries of crossing, and it stood alone in a clearing where the trees pulled back from the riverbank on both sides, creating an open space that felt, in the gray morning light, like a stage. Seren was already there when they arrived. She stood at the center of the bridge with 2 men at her back, her father's household guard, by the look of their colors. And she wore deep crimson, as she always had, with a dark traveling cloak over it. She looked at the company approaching from the north with an expression of composed satisfaction that shifted, fractionally, when she saw the full shape of what was coming toward her. She had expected, perhaps, a frightened Omega and a defensive king. What she saw instead was something else entirely. Mabel rode at the front, not beside Adrian, at the front. She rode without armor, in the practical clothes of the northern settlement, her blonde braid over one shoulder, the copper wolf brooch at her collar catching the gray morning light. Behind her came Runa, straight-backed and silver-haired, with the absolute authority of someone who had been a power in the north since before Seren's father was born. Beside Runa, the 2 Lycan warriors, patient and enormous and entirely without urgency. And behind them, Adrian, not leading, not commanding, supporting. Serene's composed satisfaction took on a different quality, something recalculated behind her eyes. Mabel dismounted at the foot of the bridge and walked to its center, stopping 10 paces from Seren. She did not reach for the knife at her belt. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood, with the particular stillness she had learned in the Greywood, and waited. "You came," Seren said, smooth, controlled. "I came," Mabel agreed pleasantly. "I also brought Runa of the northern Lycan clans, who has held the history of this territory for 40 years, and who can confirm, before any court in any kingdom, the legitimacy of the bloodline claim you intended to use as leverage." She tilted her head slightly. "Which means the leverage does not exist in the form you believed it did." A pause. The river ran fast beneath the bridge, loud in the quiet. "You think this ends here?" Seren said. Her voice had thinned slightly. "I think it ended the moment you chose threat over dignity," Mabel said. Her voice was not unkind. It was simply final. "I think you have spent a very long time believing that what you had with Adrian was interrupted rather than concluded, and that belief has led you to choices that have cost you your position, your credibility, and whatever genuine goodwill remained." She held Seren's gaze without blinking. "I am not your enemy. I was never your enemy, but I will not be threatened, and I will not be used, and I will not stand aside for someone who had every opportunity to be what they were needed to be, and chose calculation instead." Seren looked at her for a long moment. Then her gaze moved to Adrian, standing at the foot of the bridge. Whatever she found in his face, it was clear enough. The composed mask thinned further, and underneath it, briefly visible, was something that might have been grief in a different person. The grief of someone who had held on to something too long and with the wrong hands, and had finally watched it become unreachable. She looked back at Mabel. "You are not what I expected," she said quietly. Something in her voice had changed. "No," Mabel agreed. "I imagine I am not." Seren straightened. She looked once more at Adrian. Then she turned. And she walked back across the bridge, and her 2 guards fell in behind her without a word, and the sound of hooves on old stone faded south into the trees. The ride back north took 2 days, and they were different days than the ride south had been. In the weeks that followed, much was settled. Carefully, honestly, with the particular patience of people who had learned what impatience cost. Adrian stayed in the Coldwater Valley through the end of summer, not as a king making demands, but as a man making himself useful, helping with the fence posts, learning the northern remedies from the settlement's new healer, sitting across the fire from Runa in the evenings, while the elder told him things about the history of the northern clans and the bloodline that ran in Mabel's family that reframed entire chapters of the history he thought he had known. Mabel watched this and said nothing for a while. Then she watched a little longer. Then she stopped watching and simply let it be what it was. On the last evening of summer, when the valley had turned gold and the first breath of autumn was in the air, she and Adrian sat on the low stone wall above the river, and she told him what she had decided. She would return to Vordenhall, not as the Omega healer who had arrived uncertain and left silently, but as herself, fully, with the complete understanding of what she was and what she carried. She would carry with her the formal recognition of the Northern Lycan clans, which Runa had granted 3 days after the confrontation at Fenn's Bridge, making her the first person in 4 generations to hold a legitimate bond between the Southern Kingdoms and the Northern Territories. She would return as a partner, as an equal, or she would not return at all. He had agreed before she finished the sentence. Runa watched them ride south on a clear September morning. The valley spread behind her, the river catching the early light. She stood at the outer gate for a long time after the last rider disappeared between the trees. Then she went inside and sat at the long table and drank her morning tea in the particular comfortable silence of someone who has seen a thing through to its proper conclusion and finds the result satisfactory. They were bonded again at Vordenhall on the first day of winter, in a ceremony that was smaller than the first and meant more, attended by the castle's inner circle and, making the journey south for the first time in 40 years, Runa of the Northern Lycan clans, who stood at the back of the great hall in her fur mantle and watched with wolf-gray eyes and said nothing at all, which was, everyone who knew her agreed, the highest form of approval she possessed. Bren cried. He would deny this categorically for the rest of his life, and there was no evidence to contradict him, which he considered a matter of professional dignity. Adrian placed the copper wolf brooch back at Mabel's collar with his own hands, and this time it stayed. Seren remained at her father's estate in the eastern reaches. In the years that followed, the reports that came back suggested she had found, eventually, the kind of life that suited her, directing her considerable intelligence toward the management of her family's considerable lands, with a sharpness that the estate had apparently long needed. It was not the life she had reached for. It was perhaps the life that had always been the right fit. If only she had looked at it squarely from the beginning. Mabel took up the healer's work at Vordenhall again, though it looked different now. She rebuilt the healer's room with Northern Lycan knowledge woven through Southern pack practice, and healers came from 3 kingdoms to learn from her within 5 years. She was never merely the queen. She was always also the healer, and she found that the 2 things, rather than competing, made each other stronger. The Northern Lycan clans and the Kingdom of Vordenhall formed an alliance that held for generations, built on a foundation that everyone agreed was unusual, not forged in battle or politics, but in a cup of pine broth handed to a king standing in the snow at a healer's door, and in the unbroken will of a woman who walked into the grey wood alone in winter, and came back as something the world had not seen in a very long time. Adrian ruled for many years more, and those who served him noted that he was a different kind of king than he had been. Not softer exactly, but more certain of what mattered, and less likely to mistake familiarity for loyalty or silence for peace. He listened more than he spoke in council, which was not what anyone expected of him, and which produced, his advisors grudgingly admitted, considerably better outcomes. He never forgot the morning he had stood at a healer's door in Ashven with snow in his hair and 2 empty hands, and a woman had handed him warmth without asking what it cost her. He spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that, and in the quiet opinion of everyone who knew them both, expressed mostly in glances exchanged across great halls, and in the particular way the castle seemed to breathe differently when they were both in it, he came very close.